What if George Romney had been the Republican nominee in 1968 and won? In the annals of American political history, the year 1968 looms large, a turbulent era marked by war, civil unrest, and a society wrestling with profound cultural and ideological transformations. Amidst this backdrop, one defining moment was the election of President Richard Nixon. But what if the Republican Party had nominated George Romney instead? And what if Romney went on to win the presidency? How might the course of American history have changed? This thought experiment challenges us to delve deep into the political crossroads of 1968 and consider the profound implications of a George Romney presidency. By speculating on alternative possibilities, we can better understand how individual leaders shape not only their time, but the destiny of a nation. To appreciate the potential impact of George Romney in 1968, we must first explore the historical and political context. America in 1968 was a nation on edge. The Vietnam War was raging, with mounting casualties abroad and growing anti-war demonstrations at home. The Civil Rights Movement, while securing significant legislative victories earlier in the decade, faced a backlash as tensions and riots erupted in cities across the country. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy further amplified the sense of national distress. Within this environment, the Republican Party itself was at a crossroads. The GOP faced an internal clash between its moderate wing, which sought bipartisan solutions, and a growing conservative movement embodied in figures like Barry Goldwater, Nixon, and later, Ronald Reagan. Nixon's ability to appeal to both factions and his law and order platform gave him the edge in securing the presidential nomination at the Republican National Convention. George Romney, who once led in polls during the primaries, stumbled, famously declaring his prior support for the Vietnam War had been the result of a brainwashing, an admission that many saw as politically damaging. This context is critical in understanding why Romney's candidacy faltered and why imagining him as the Republican nominee and the 37th president offers such a compelling speculative exercise. George Romney was no ordinary politician. The son of Mormon missionaries, he rose to prominence as a successful businessman and a progressive leader. As the CEO of American Motors Corporation, he turned the struggling company around by focusing on smaller, fuel-efficient cars, a bold move that contrasted with the industry's focus at the time. His success in business translated into politics, where he served as governor of Michigan from 1963 to 1969. Romney was a vocal supporter of civil rights, using his political platform as governor to advance issues of racial justice during a time of intense national division. He also stood out as a Republican, willing to embrace bipartisan collaboration, making him a stark contrast to the increasingly polarized figures within his party. However, his candidacy for the 1968 nomination was derailed not only by his comments on Vietnam, but by his less confrontational style in a political environment that rewarded Nixon's combative pragmatism. In this exercise, we are challenged to imagine what might have happened if Romney's political authenticity and moderate policies had prevailed. What kind of America would have emerged under his leadership? Let's first reimagine the Republican primaries of 1968. For Romney to have secured the nomination, a few things would have needed to happen differently. First, his infamous brainwashing comments on Vietnam might have been better framed or avoided altogether. It's possible that a more nuanced explanation of his shift on Vietnam could have resonated with voters craving an end to the war. Similarly, stronger engagement with the party's more conservative base might have helped build a broader coalition within the GOP. With Nixon sidelined, George Romney would have faced Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic nominee, in the general election. Humphrey, burdened by his association with Lyndon B. Johnson's unpopular presidency and the ongoing war, struggled to gain traction. Many voters sought an alternative, and Romney's moderate stance, coupled with his opposition to the Vietnam War, could have appealed to independents and war-weary Americans. However, George Wallace's third-party candidacy, with its appeal to Southern voters, would still likely have shaped electoral dynamics. Would Romney's opposition to segregationist policies have alienated some conservatives, or could his leadership style have transcended those divides? For the sake of this thought experiment, Let's assume Romney not only secures the Republican nomination, but also wins the presidency in November of 1968. A Romney presidency would likely have been defined by pragmatism, moderation, and bipartisanship. Where Nixon often relied on secrecy and distrust, Romney's open leadership style might have fostered greater public confidence in government. Key areas of policy, including Vietnam, civil rights, and economic reforms, would have likely followed a different trajectory under his administration. One of the most immediate and consequential issues facing Romney in 1969 would have been the Vietnam War. Unlike Nixon, who adopted a strategy of prolonging the conflict while seeking peace with honor, Romney might have pursued a faster de-escalation. As a vocal critic of the war and its handling, it's possible his administration would have prioritized withdrawal and pursued diplomatic solutions more aggressively. Would this have reduced the widespread protests and polarization of the late 1960s and early 1970s? Or, alternatively, could it have led to criticism and political backlash from hawkish lawmakers and military leaders? In terms of foreign policy, Romney's business acumen and straightforward nature may have led to a different approach to Cold War diplomacy. Nixon's strategy emphasized realpolitik and engagement with China and the Soviet Union. Romney might have sought similar breakthroughs, but may have emphasized economic partnerships rather than secretive dealings. How this would have affected relations with global powers and the broader trajectory of the Cold War is an open question. Romney's record as governor offers strong clues about how he might have approached civil rights issues as president. Unlike Nixon, who employed a Southern strategy to appeal to white voters resistant to civil rights, Romney was a principled advocate for racial equality. He was one of the few Republican leaders of his time to march with Martin Luther King Jr. and actively spoke out against segregation and discrimination. As president, Romney may have advanced more bipartisan civil rights legislation or strengthened federal support for urban programs and education. His dignified advocacy could have inspired a more collaborative approach to tackling racial inequalities during one of the most divisive periods in American history. With his background in the auto industry, Romney's presidency may have emphasized innovation in the economy. His leadership likely would have focused on balancing free enterprise with government responsibility, championing policies to address unemployment, inflation, and economic fairness. During Nixon's tenure, economic challenges such as stagflation and the oil crisis created lasting impacts. Romney's business-driven approach might have mitigated some of these challenges, or at least set a different tone for addressing them. One of the sharpest contrasts between Nixon and Romney lies in character and leadership style. Nixon's administration was defined by secrecy, culminating in the Watergate scandal, which forever altered Americans' trust in government. Could Romney's presidency have fostered greater openness and faith in political leadership? His reputation for honesty and pragmatism suggests he may have set a less confrontational and suspicious tone in the White House. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of a Romney presidency is its potential impact on the Republican Party. Nixon's presidency marked a significant shift, steering the party toward a more conservative and combative identity that later crystallized under Ronald Reagan. Romney, by contrast, epitomized the moderate, solutions-oriented conservative, a figure willing to prioritize unity over division. A Romney presidency might have kept the Republican Party aligned with its mid-century ethos of moderation, fostering a platform based on bipartisanship and progressive conservatism. Would this centrist Republican identity have persisted, or would the conservative movement still have emerged as a dominant force? It's a tantalizing question for political scholars. Beyond policy and party politics, Romney's hypothetical leadership invites speculation about the cultural tone of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Could his inclusive rhetoric and cooperative style have tempered some of the cultural upheavals of the era? Or would the social movements and counterculture rebellion have persisted regardless of who occupied the Oval Office? Leadership often shapes not just policy, but also the emotional climate of a nation. In addition, how might figures like Nixon and Reagan have adjusted their political trajectories in response to a Romney presidency? Would the ideological shifts we now view as inevitable have been delayed or even reversed under Romney's more moderate brand of leadership? Speculating about history is not about delivering definitive answers, but about exploring the possibilities. A George Romney presidency in 1968, marked by bipartisanship, transparency, and progressive conservatism, offers a fascinating alternative to the Nixon era. His leadership might have changed the trajectory of the Vietnam War, civil rights, and even the Republican Party itself. This thought experiment asks us to consider not only how history could have unfolded differently, but also what lessons we can draw for today. Leadership matters. Decisions echo across generations. And while we cannot change the past, exploring it reminds us to study how current leaders and decisions will shape our shared future. So, what do you think? Could George Romney have led America down a more unified path? Or were the divisions of the late 1960s too vast for any leader to overcome? Share your thoughts, and let's continue the discussion. Like and subscribe for more from History Twist.